My name is Rosemary James. I'm the co-founder of the Faulkner Society and the Words and Music Literary Festival, and we're very delighted that you could come out and be with us today. I'm especially delighted by our speaking guest today. When I was working on the Old States Item afternoon newspaper, Walter came to work as a very young man, and Karen Essex, another New Orleanian, is someone whose books I have been following for a long time. Her book on Leonardo was more about the women who wanted to have him paint them than about the master himself. And I thought that was a great take. I'm going to turn the program over now to Karen, and she's going to introduce Walter. Thank you.
Walter Isaacson was born in New Orleans. He attended Isidore Newman High School, where he was president of the student body. And that seems to have soured him on running for political office at a very early age. From there, he graduated from Harvard, and then he toddled off to Oxford, where he finished his studies in politics and philosophy with honors. He began his journalism career at the London Times, and then after a stint at the Times-Picayune, he went to Time magazine and eventually became its editor-in-chief. In 2001, he became CEO of CNN, where he attempted the noble task of reaching across the aisle in the spirit of bipartisan journalism. As president of the Aspen Institute, he continued to foster this open-minded, nonpartisan political dialogue. He left the Institute earlier this year to become a professor of history at our own Tulane University. As an author, he's taken on people of extraordinary human excellence: Albert Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, Henry Kissinger, Steve Jobs, other geniuses of the tech era, and now perhaps the most illustrious of all, Leonardo da Vinci. If I list all of Walter's accomplishments, we won't have time for our talk. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Walter Isaacson.
Thank you. And thank you, Karen.
All right, well, Walter generously asked me, or told me that I could ask him anything. Poor man. So I'm going to begin with the hardest question that I could possibly ask, and you'll have to answer. In the last 45 or so years, has your bowling improved? I heard a rumor from one of your former teachers at Newman that you were an extraordinary student, but not that good of a bowler.
I do not remember this.
I think his
Dave
name,
Prescott?
Mr. Tutwiler.
Oh, okay. Well, I do love rock and bowl. I go there a lot, depending on who's playing.
I was thinking my daughter's here. She's a great bowler. Maybe we could, you know.
Yes, right. I don't think it's improved, though.
Well, in all seriousness, here we are in New Orleans, and so I thought I would start with a little bit about New Orleans. This is a city that leaves an indelible mark on anyone who's born here. How has your New Orleans roots influenced your work and your writing and your career choices?
Well, I write about people who have a great deal of creativity. And at first I thought, well, that's just because they're really smart. But then you realize, you know, smart people are a dime a dozen. They don't generally amount to much. What matters is being creative. And that creativity tends to come from being interested in all sorts of disciplines and rubbing up against people from different backgrounds and different disciplines. And I thought that, you're looking at Florence, right? Well, it just disappeared. But Florence in 1470 was filled with all sorts of people, including people coming in from the fall of Constantinople with the Arab, people from all continents. It was a great trading empire. It was very much like New Orleans. And that creativity came when a 12-year-old kid comes from the village of Vinci and moves in there, because he's rubbing up against great musicians and artists, but also engineers and mathematicians doing perspective. And I came to believe that there's certain times and places that are cradles of creativity. 1470 Florence, exactly 500 years later in the Bay Area of California, when the hippie movement and the electric Kool-Aid acid test and the homebrew computer club and the engineers at Intel are all in that cauldron. And that New Orleans in particular invents and creates things because of its mix of people, and usually it's a live and let live tolerant attitude, but also the friction that comes when we rub different groups together and there's a bit of a friction to it. I mean, just real quickly take the one obvious example, which is jazz. You had freed slaves coming down from the plantations with their spirituals. You had the sanctified church. You had the Creole orchestras. You had the marching bands from the Spanish-American War coming back and hawking their cornets. You had the drummers in Congo Square. And each one of those things, you can just take a syncopated beat or a backbeat or the ragging of a thing and say that came from this person being part of the mix. So as you watch the evolution of so many things, whether it's Leonardo's Da Vinci's creativity or the type of things, it comes from being in a place like New Orleans. I won't say is tolerant of diversity, but amused and celebrates and savors diversity even as it causes some frictions.
Very true. You've given me a hint now that I think we can trace maybe our mutual interest in Leonardo straight to our roots in New Orleans. Well, I grew up Catholic and Italian, so automatically
Well,
I grew
that
up in
helps.
Italian culture.
And you were Dominican? Yeah.
And yes. But whether one is Catholic or not here, the church sort of prevails. It sort of presides over the city. So we're kind of automatically connected to Renaissance or religious art. I think that's one way in. But I also, the festivity here, the Mardi Gras cruise that harken back to the past. I was thinking perhaps Leonardo would have really enjoyed Mardi Gras.
Well, you know why he loved, yeah, he did. He was a real dandy of a dresser, wore short purple and pink tunics. But his first job, when he gets to Florence and works in Verrocchio's studio, is doing pageants, plays, processions, outdoor festivities. We kind of forget that that was a big deal back then. There was no TV or movies and things. So every night there was something. So if you look at what Leonardo creates, whether it's his art or his engineering, it tends to derive from the pageants and plays. If you look at The Last Supper, it's basically a stage set with the walls coming in with artificial perspective. If you look at the helicopter he was supposedly invented, that aerial screw, famous drawing, that was to bring angels down from the rafters in a performance of Danae. So these are the type of things that a theatrical sort of mindset, a costume mindset, and he was a bit of a misfit. Steve Jobs talks about, here's to the misfits, the rebels, the round pegs in the square hole. Leonardo, when he gets to Florence from Vinci at age 12, he's illegitimate, he's gay, he's left-handed, he's decided for a while to be a vegetarian, he's sometimes heretical, he's distracted, and he's totally adored in Florence. So, you can be a character. And trust me, you and I both have lived on Dumaine Street on either ends of it. We know characters, and Leonardo was a character and very embraced in Milan.
That's true, and this city is a city of characters and big personalities. Even people who, just normal, regular people. To me, New Orleans people have very big personalities. So it's not surprising that we have both been drawn to writing about these huge characters, these big historical figures.
How did you get on to Isabella and Beatrice d'Este?
Oh, well, this is the truth, and this is why I believe in God. I was lying on the floor of my office one day. I had no intention of writing another book, and I pulled a book off the shelf that I bought when I was a student at Tulane, and I opened it, and I started reading about these women who were all connected to the Duke of Milan, and were all being painted by Leonardo. And, he was the rock star painter of the day. Of course, these women wanted to be painted by him. And I thought, oh my goodness, this must be, this is great drama. These women all competing to be painted by Leonardo and all connected to the Duke of Milan. And then I didn't really think much about it, and then a friend, also from Tulane, called me that very evening, I swear to you people, and said, my brother and I are making a tour of northern Italy. Would you like to come?
Yeah.
Isabella d'Este was a very powerful woman, very rich, patron of all the famous artists of the Renaissance. And she was known in the courts of Europe as the first lady of the world. And she was a style maven. People made dolls in her image. Anyway, so she's a big persona. And Leonardo did not bow to her wishes like everyone else did. He was totally dependent on his patrons.
Well, he is dependent on his patrons, but often doesn't deliver paintings to them, and thus is never that wealthy. I mean, he could have churned out portraits and Madonna and Childs for the rich merchants. This is another cloth merchant's wife he does in Florence early on, and he just gets sort of smitten by certain subjects. But the Mona Lisa he paints in 1503 when your friend Isabella d'Este has sent letter after letter, an emissary saying, I will pay you anything to paint my portrait. I mean, it just goes, I mean, those letters are somewhat
she
funny.
Hounded him.
Sends poor friars, I think it was Friar Novello, if I remember, like as an emissary. And instead, he paints a wife of a middle-class cloth merchant and never gets paid for it. But it was Leonardo. He knew what he wanted to do, and he did not dance to the music of patrons. And he just gets sort of smitten by certain subjects. And I think it was just part of who he was that everything needed to be done for its own sake. Whether he's studying the flight of birds, or whether he's doing his engineering or his science, his anatomy. I mean, his anatomy is just huge, notebook after notebook, where he's doing human dissections. And it starts when he's trying to make sure he gets the muscles of the neck right, and St. Jerome in the Wilderness, but then he keeps dissecting. And he's going down, he does the heart, he does the liver, he figures out how the heart valve works, and he's doing it for its own sake, rather than doing it because somebody was paying him to do it, or it had some useful purpose. And this is actually an enormous step, not only in human history, but almost the history of all species, which is when curiosity comes about for its own sake. We have a species that around 1500 quit trying to learn things just because they had to learn them and started to say, I'm going to be curious about this for its own sake, which gives you everything from Darwin and Newton and Galileo and in Copernicus, an entire scientific revolution that totally separates Homo sapiens from other species.
I think that's one of the most interesting thing about his portraits is, prior to that, people would commission portraits. They were painted very formally, or it was all religious art. And Leonardo brought human qualities to his paintings, and I think that's why people are still lining up to see.
There's a depth of emotion. Yes, Salvador Mundi, the reason it sold for far too much money,
far too much,
is because there's and it's the Mona Lisa. It's every time you look at her, she has different emotions. He was very intent on how do inner emotions get reflected in outward facial gestures and stuff. So he goes around, I mean, if you look at the Mona Lisa, you can see it's just a depth of inner emotion that no other painting has. But so he goes around Florence and with his notebook, trying to see everybody's face, guessing what their emotion is, and sketching it. But he also dissects the spinal cord and the brain to figure out which muscles are controlled by the nervous system from the brain and which from the spinal, so which are, express emotions. And you see it in The Last Supper, a very theatrical thing where everybody's got an emotion, but you see it, that's a main, it's one of the 20 main things he brings to art, which is showing emotion on the panel.
And it was new. That was a
He
new
brings that to
development in art.
There's a baptism of Christ that's been rotating through there, and when we get to it, It's done by Verrocchio, his teacher, but Leonardo gets to paint the angel on the far left. That angel is turning, he's moving, he's twisting, and he's got so many emotions as he looks up at Jesus. And you think, wow, that's so different from anything else that's ever been painted. And you look at the angel next to him, which Verrocchio did, and he's turning and looking at the Leonardo's angel, and the only emotion is, how did I get here next to something that has never been this way before?
Well, I know that there are a lot of writers in our audience and a lot of aspiring writers as well. And so I know that people are very curious about our research process.
There are more than 7,200 pages of his notebooks. And I kind of started stumbling upon them 25 years ago when I'd go to Florence where my wife had studied. And, you know, after you've seen the Adoration of the Magi there, you then go look at his notebooks. I mean, here they're flashing up. And you say, oh my goodness, if I could just go page by page through his notebooks and see how he's connecting art and science and do it chronologically. And so my research process is try to go back to the original sources, Ben Franklin's letters, Einstein's letters and papers, Leonardo's notebooks, and be boringly chronological. Even the notes I take, I do hundreds of pages of notes, but if something happened in 1493, it's before, you know, in my notes right before anything that happens in 1494, so I can do a narrative chronology. It was somebody who loved everything, every pattern of nature. And by having that feel for any subject and discipline, it enriches and deepens his art and engineering.
It makes him a very complex subject to try to understand and write about.
Yeah, although in some ways it's very revealing. You know, you say, oh, I get it. That's, I mean, for example, on the, oh, you said Salvator Mundi, that painting that sold for too much money. If you look at his Jesus' blessing hand, it's very sharply delineated, unlike almost anything Leonardo does. But if you look at his notebooks, he's doing what he calls sharpness perspective, which is understanding that at a certain distance from your eye, about arm's length, you have a focal point, and suddenly what looks like the lines of your face at this distance, which are not incredibly sharply delineated, nothing is, something gets sharp, well, it makes it look like Jesus is reaching out of the panel and almost touching us because he's made the hand sharper. This is something he discovers and writes about in his notebooks and then applies to his art. And if you look at St. Jerome, there he is on the far left, and Leonardo trying to do the muscle. 25 years later, you get to that notebook page where he actually finally dissects all of the muscles in the neck. And he goes back and corrects the St. Jerome that he hasn't yet finished and gets the neck muscles right because he had done the dissections.
Can you compare him to anyone else in history, really?
Well, I love comparing him to people who love to cross disciplines and love everything from anatomy to art, whatever. And there are people throughout history who try to know everything that can possibly be known about everything that's knowable. I mean, obviously Aristotle, and to some extent,
Very good, yes.
yeah, Socrates. But even later, I mean, Benjamin Franklin, not as much of a genius as Leonardo, but he cares about whirlwinds and swirls of water, discovers the Gulf Stream, understands waves of electricity. He also understands how Newton's mechanics and balances work, and he applies that to the Constitution on, you know, separation of powers and balances of powers. So people who think across disciplines have always excited me, and Benjamin Franklin is sort of our founding generation's, not Leonardo da Vinci, that would be giving him slightly too much credit, but somebody who tried to know everything about everything you could know.
You know, you write about these giants of history, and I've taken on a couple myself, like Cleopatra, Leonardo, and I find it a very intimidating process. I have to work myself into, you know, taking on these subjects when there's already so much existing material, you know, about them. And I wonder how do you organize all of this? Because your books are very fluid. And what I like about them is they read like novels. You tell stories. You tell the stories of, you give context and background and psychology. And I just wonder how, getting back to the research, so you start at the beginning, but is there a process of organization that you go through to make it a story?
Well, we celebrated this morning, as we always do at Words and Music, Walker Percy. And one of my favorite lines of Walker Percy, which is there are two types of people who come out of Louisiana, preachers and storytellers. And they said, for heaven's sake, be a storyteller. The world has far too many preachers. And there's a simple 6 words that whenever I am stumped, or whenever I'm having a block, or somebody asks me a tough question, like you just did, my words that come to my head are, let me tell you a story. Storytelling comes naturally to people from New Orleans.
That's true.
And storytelling tends to be narrative, and it tends to be subtle. It has a point. And if you look, you can take the greatest of all, the Bible. The Bible doesn't just give you the 10 Commandments. It gives you Moses coming down from the mount. It has the best lead sentence ever, in the beginning, comma. So it's going to be a narrative. And so I think we can revert to storytelling as a way to convey moral messages, as opposed to preaching and saying 10 lessons for creativity. You say, let me tell you a story. So tell me how you do it.
My answer would be the same. My mother always had a good career going, so I was raised by my grandmother, great-grandmother, and great-aunt, and they're all little Italian ladies who cooked all day long. And as a child, I was in that kitchen listening to their stories, probably mostly inappropriate for a 5, 6, 7-year-old child, but I really loved listening to them talk about people, gossip like mad, but also the old stories about, how Mama and Papa came to this country and what they did in Italy. And it just, it's natural. It just came naturally, I guess. And then also, my first writing career was in screenwriting, and you really have to be conscious of keeping your audience's attention in screenwriting. It's often said that writing chooses us. We don't really choose writing. And I'd extrapolate a little bit on that and say that our subjects choose us as well. I know the aha moments when I know I'm going to write a book. And I wonder, did you have an aha moment with Leonardo? Because he represents a bit of a departure for you, because he belongs to the distant past. I just wonder if you had a moment of...
At the beginning of Lord of the Rings, Gandalf says, not all who wander are lost. I kind of wandered into a pattern and then realized, okay, I'm not lost. I know where, which is, one book leads to another. I started with a friend writing a very obscure book called The Wise Men, which is about 6 friends and how they created foreign policy. It ends in Vietnam, and I said, well, I got to do somebody that explains the whole Vietnam era, and that I took on Kissinger for that reason. But also, I understood the balance of power diplomacy that Dr. Kissinger was trying to do. And I realized that the person who invented that for the U.S. was Benjamin Franklin, who plays off the Bourbon Pact nations against England during the Revolution. And then, having done Franklin, I was just mesmerized. And by the way, that's a very valid word, because he's the one who disproved Mesmer's theory of magnetism. That's where we get the word. Yeah, Ben Franklin, the King of France, puts him at the head of a commission to see if Mesmer is a fraud or not. And that's where we get the word mesmerizing. Franklin, his electricity experiments were awesome. And so I decided I wanted to try to demystify science, which led to Einstein. After I did Ben Franklin and Albert Einstein, I got a call from Steve Jobs, and he said, do me next. Well, yeah, you arrogant. Franklin, Einstein, you.
Yeah.
And I actually said, let me wait 30, 40 years until you retire. But then I was told, if you're going to do them, you have to do them now, because he hadn't told people, but he had been diagnosed. So it was only after that sequence that I realized every single one of these people, including Einstein, but certainly Franklin and especially Steve Jobs, whenever Steve would end his product presentation, it was always with a street sign intersection showing the arts and sciences. He said, if you stand at that intersection, you'll be creative. And he kept saying, Vitruvian Man, you know, the guy doing jumping jacks in the circle and the square, that's the symbol of people who stand at the intersection of art and science. And Leonardo is that, but people keep thinking he's a painter. Somebody should do a book on him that shows that his engineering and his art were not two separate endeavors, but interwoven. He's squaring the circle here. It's a mathematical issue. He's also loving the design of churches and how they should be proportioned, according to the ancient architect Vitruvius. He has friends trying to figure out how to illustrate those proportions, and then he does the greatest iconic drawing in history. That's a very creative work of science, mathematics, and of art. And so that's what led me to the culmination of a series of books about the creativity that comes from crossing disciplines, you know, that would have to culminate with Leonardo da Vinci. And he sees patterns. He sees the swirling pattern of the water when he's a little boy in Vinci, but understands it's the same spiral as a curl of hair, but also the same spiral as blood makes when it goes from the heart to the aorta, and thus opens the valve. And so by looking at different disciplines, people see patterns across them, and to me, that is an ingredient of creativity.
Well, that's certainly how unique things come into the world. We both write about people who actually existed. You more than me. I'm a fiction writer, but my characters are almost all historically based characters. And how do you handle it when you discover something about your subject that you don't like, that may even repulse you? Do you try to protect the character, or do you...
The hardest on this, and I'll still be discreet about it, was Steve Jobs. If you've read my book, which I'm not trying to push people to, but it's good. You get to parts of it where you get kind of squeamish because he is a true jerk at times, and it gets me very squeamish. And he's that way to coworkers, but also members of his family at times, his kids, and he's brutal at times. Now that drives people to do things that drive them nuts, but it also drives them to do things that they didn't think they'd be able to do. And they say, you know, he totally enraged me, but I wouldn't have given up the chance to work with him. So you're trying to pull that together. But the toughest part of your question is, I'm extrapolating your question a bit, as a journalist, as I was and am, I guess, are there things you leave out? And there were, with my help of my wife, when I did the first draft of Steve Jobs, there were things he said about people I know he loved, friends I know he liked, even people very close to him, that were just offhanded and brutal a bit. And I left some out, but I put some in to show things. And Kathy said, take that out. And you have to balance how important is it to the reader in understanding it versus how painful and hurtful will it be to a real human being. And I'd gotten the balance slightly wrong, and Kathy said, take these parts out, and I did. That's a little different, perhaps, than if I'm writing about, you know, anybody from, you know, Bill Clinton to Donald Trump. I mean, I don't want to get political, but there's probably more necessity to just be brutally honest, you know, when it comes to a political leader than when it comes to a technologist. So I had to do that, but I watched that in history. By the way, Leonardo is gay. As I said, I pointed out his companion, one of them, Salai, we know about, very comfortable with it. You know, bring Salai, and then later on his second companion, Melzi, to dinner parties. 19th century historians from Walter Pater all the way through to 20th century historians are very uncomfortable with the fact that he's gay and basically leave it out. Now, you know, so I obviously didn't feel in any way discomforted, nor did he, about that. But there were things about Leonardo that did discomfort me. The fact he didn't finish paintings, that he gave up on things. And then I said, well, he's human. I got to put that in. That makes him more accessible or approachable, that he sometimes screwed up.
Yeah. You didn't try to make him a hero.
No, he was not a superhero, nor was he a super intellect the way Einstein was or Newton was. I mean, we'll never be able to match Einstein's, ability to apply tensor calculus to the curvature of space-time using equations. But we could all be more like Leonardo, which is look at water flowing in a bowl and say, how does it spiral? Why does it spiral that way? Why is it? All those curiosities he had. And so I think it's actually, for a while I was a little bit disappointed that he wasn't superhuman. But as I got near the end of the book, I said, actually, this makes for a better book, that he's a little bit more like us than we thought.
His humanness really surprised me when I was researching him. He was jovial, not jovial, but, he was kind. He was good to his mother. He was an accomplished equestrian. He was a very snappy dresser. And so I feel a little bad that Leonardo, in some people's hands, has become this sort of, I don't know, they use him as a bit of a pinup girl, like a cipher for their own agendas and fantasies. So, he's in the Da Vinci Code, he's a secretive, conspiratorial guy, which I
Boy,
did not
is he
find.
not. He's very
really
collegial,
not.
very up. Yeah, I mean, Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code has his notebooks, and as you probably looked, they're in mirror script, meaning he writes from right to left. And that's because he was left-handed, and back then you'd smudge the ink if you were left-handed and wrote that way, and you'd smudge in the ink. But Dan Brown says, well, it's because it was a code, it was conspiratorial. Well, no, Leonardo's much more normal.
And then that whole idea of Leonardo is then carried forth with Da Vinci's Demons, and then in Assassin's Creed, the video and the books. Now Leonardo is this conspiratorial, secretive, weird guy that he never was. And what bothers me about that is that in the minds of, the young people, then that's history instead of history.
Well, I'll turn it to you, which is this. When people fictionalize things for the sake of art, it's mainly Hollywood, which I can't quite understand. I mean, we saw Rosemary. Rosemary mentioned that she was on the States Item, which few of us remember, the late lamented afternoon green sheet. And she broke the Jim Garrison JFK story. And then Oliver Stone takes that and in some ways distorts what happens there. Aaron Sorkin wrote a book based on my Steve Jobs book, which was it was a wonderful movie, but it wasn't all factual. I'm not a real writer. I just do nonfiction. So I don't know how much liberty a writer of historical fiction like yourself, or a director like Oliver Stone, a writer like Aaron Sorkin, I guess you're allowed to take liberties, but where does the line get crossed?
That's an interesting question, and there's actually no right answer to that.
Okay.
I have rules for myself. I don't, if something is known about a character, I don't mess with that. I don't change what is known. I do invent what is unknown, because you have to create a full portrait of a character. But I try to stay true to the spirit of a person, and certainly true to the events of their lives. The hardest thing in fiction is timelines. So a person's life story does not necessarily unfold as drama. So sometimes you have to, play with timelines in order to get the drama out of a story. But you're becoming, I don't know if you've been a history professor, but you are now going to be teaching history, and I just wonder if that it bothers you maybe a little bit that what is in the popular imagination isn't right.
Well, it bothers me when it loses the spirit, as you said, of things. which is Leonardo being conspiratorial and weird or whatever. Well, no, that's wrong. When JFK, the movie, it bothered me because, you know, it was a conspiracy saying all these people were trying to kill Kennedy. Well, I don't know that is good for a whole or even Selma, which is a great movie. I respect the director. She did a good job. But she, for compression reasons and others, has LBJ sending the FBI tapes of Martin Luther King to Coretta Scott King, meaning the sex tapes. That is not true. Lyndon Johnson didn't do that. Lyndon Johnson actually was trying hard to pass a civil rights bill. I find that offensive when you're giving people a story of history that is very distorting to not just the facts, but to the overall truth.
I have to give you a compliment, by the way. I love your Henry Kissinger book, and just getting back
That
to...
separates you from Dr. Kissinger.
Yeah, no, but getting back to how you handle things, I thought that you really, you explored the depth of the man and the brilliance and also the dark side, and I really admire the
Well,
way you
it's
did
always
that.
hard, both as a journalist, as Rosemary will tell you, or as a writer. I'm not a dark person. I don't like revealing bad things. I mean, this is why I probably was not Woodward or Bernstein. I'm not in investigative journalism who loves revealing bad things. And I'm not a Bob Caro who can write about LBJ or Robert Moses and not like the subject that well. I tend to want to like my subjects, but whether it be Kissinger or Steve Jobs, when they have a dark side, you have to take a deep breath and say, I'm going to put that in. As I say, you may leave out some comment he made about a person or a family member that's just really not necessary, but you got to say, even if Kissinger's not going to like it or Steve Jobs not going to like it, I have to be tough enough to be intellectually honest.
Right. I mean, and it is a hard balance to maintain. You know, you want to tell the truth, but you also want to give somebody their humanity.
And I think in this day and age, we either tear people down sort of gleefully if we're writers or journalists,
horrible.
or sometimes or hagiographers, puff pieces, you know, just trying to, you know, People magazine like where some actor or actress is saintly and saving elephants or whatever they're doing. I think the hardest thing, which is lost in this age in which we become so polarized, is that when the president, whoever the president might be, whether it's Obama or Trump or whatever, does something, you don't have to immediately decide, I'm going to eviscerate it or I'm going to praise it to high heaven. You have to say, you know, let's try to see both the good and the bad. You know, let's try to see all sides of this. That used to be at the core of writing, of history, and of journalism, and that's been reduced recently.
Very much. I wake up every morning and my mantra is, I will not argue on Facebook. I will not argue on Facebook. Because I have found exactly what you said. You know, you read something, you think, oh, this is horrible. And you want to immediately get into an argument about it. But if you have 5 minutes to think and consider the other side of it, then, you know, you can take a deep breath, you see both sides, you don't feel so combative. But I think that's the worst thing.
My mantra is I don't watch cable news, and we don't have cable here. So, because, I mean, cable news is in the business of getting you worked up and riled up, whether it's Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow or whatever it may be. And the world isn't that way.
No, and they are good at it, too.
That's what gives ratings these days.
Well, can I ask you what's next for you as an author?
I was actually in the rain talking to my editor. I've got 3 or 4 books I'm dancing around. But one is very much about New Orleans. And I'll say it here, and somebody can run with it if if they want to scoop me on it. But I've been interested in Lulu White, the woman in the 1890s who was an octoroon Creole, or quadroon, depending on what year it was when she decided, who opens Mahogany Hall, which is one of the 3 or 4 great sporting houses in Storyville. And part of it in the 1890s is the ability to cross the color line. I think probably Emily Epstein has one, Spectacular Wickedness. Gary Christ has a book which you should buy, Empire of Sin. And there's the Blue Books of Storyville book that's also been out recently here. Lulu White in the 1890s, among other things, decides it'd be cool. They all have professors, they're called, meaning the piano player. She has Jelly Roll Morton, who hires a very young Louis Armstrong as a cornetist. But also part of it is the allure of crossing the color line. And it's all octoroons and quadroons. But she has a friend named Homer Plessy, who lives on Basin and Frenchman, and is also octoroon, and boards the train famously, and gets told to sit in the colored car, and he won't, and it becomes Plessy v. Ferguson. At which point, suddenly, by law, and you're from an Italian family, back then the line between Italians and, say, the uptown elite was as strict and as strong as between the Creoles and octoroons in the uptown. There wasn't a color line, especially in Creole society in New Orleans. But suddenly, legally, you have to draw the color line. And it changes everything, not just in New Orleans, but in this country. And so I'm thinking of trying to do that narrative. It's hard because, you know, she doesn't have 7,000 pages of notes. She does have blue books with a lot of customers. I think I'll have to worry about people's great-grandfathers being in the blue book. But that's one of the 3 or 4 stories I've been playing with in my mind.
That's fascinating. I hope you do that.
Okay.
And I can tell you, when you're writing about women from history, you really have to read between the lines of history because women didn't write their stories. And so all women's history is hidden history.
Yeah, and it's also, this is very much of a gender story because, I mean, and I, as a man, am probably a little bit afraid to write it because partly it's about prostitution, but it's about the reformers trying to stop it, but people like Lulu White who actually think it empowers women to be able to open these sporting houses and become an owner of it. So it has a complexity to it that I'm not sure I'm up for.
I think that's still a fascinating conversation, that issue of, you know, what you do with your body, of prostitution. Is it empowering? I wrote for Playboy at some point, and my mother says, my daughter made it into Playboy with her clothes on.
No.
And I interviewed women in the sex trade, and quite a few felt that they were empowered by this, you know, that this was what they wanted to do and they made money. And so the other side says, no, it's total exploitation.
Well, there are a lot of books about Storyville that either take it was horrible exploitation, as Spectacular Wickedness, the book does, or the Gary Christ book is on the other side. And it's about our reformer instincts. And we decide, okay, we got to get rid of Storyville, but that also leads us to be a little bit less tolerant on race, on Italian. You know, the more Italians were lynched during that period than blacks in New Orleans.
There was a
and that's, of course, the
lynching.
decade right then where they put up Robert E. Lee and other things happened. So it's a very complicated time, and I think I'm going to let it marinate for a while before I'm sure I can at least attempt it.
I think you can handle it.
It's harder than Leonardo.
Well, with that, I know that we were asked to open it up to questions.
I'm
So
sorry if we've droned on too much.
we would love to take some questions. I'll tell you what Walter told me. Ask us anything.
No. I don't know if you're calling or there's a woman right there.
Right there,
Yeah,
lady?
yeah.
Yes.
I was just reading in the recent New Yorker that Peter Schendahl was talking about the overpriced Leonardo, and he made the point that that one of the things in the Mona Lisa and in the Mundo Cristo, is that what it is?
Salvador Mundi, Christ the Savior of the world.
That the eyes are doing something different from the mouth.
In the Mona Lisa in particular, you have the lips that have 16 years worth of slight glaze strokes, so that every angle from which you look at it, the light is slightly different. And the details in black and white turn down at the edges, but the shadows and colors turn up, which means the different parts of your retina see it differently. It looks like all of a sudden she's smiling, she's not smiling. The eyes have a depth of emotion and, of course, follow you, which is also called the Mona Lisa effect. And they shift as well with the look. This is why when people say, is the Mona Lisa really a masterpiece? I say, look, you don't get it. It is 100 times more of a masterpiece than you think. That emotion is particularly true in Salvador Mundi's both mouth and in his blessing hand that is reaching out at you. It's been so over-restored that I'm leery of the eyes because I think they were messed up, and it's basically the restorers have done it. So I don't know what the eyes originally looked like.
Yeah.
Of the thousands of pages of notes that you referenced that were the genesis of the information you needed to write this book, where are they? Are they private or public?
The interesting thing is that his notebooks have not all ever been totally collected, even online. So for my wife, Kathy, and I, it was an arduous task because you have to go to where they are, which is Florence, Venice, Paris, Milan, London, Windsor Castle. So it's torture. And Bill Gates is home because he has the Codex Leicester. I have a great good fortune of just being, I don't want to be arrogant, but well enough known that I can talk my way into places. If you look at the book, at the author's photograph, in the inside dust jacket, it's me hovering over Vitruvian Man, which is never put on display, but is in the 4th floor of the Academy in Venice. Bill Gates was very nice, not only allowed me access to the Codex Leicester, but he's having a team retranslate it, which will be published next year, which will be a great book, but he gave me early access to the thing. So that's part of the shoe leather that's done, but it's obviously fun. It's like when you go duck hunting, or whatever. It's not just the duck, it's the hunt that's sort of fun.
Tell us a little bit about what you found out about St. John the Baptist and why we call him St. John the Baptist. When I first saw him many years ago, I was very young, in the Louvre, and it struck me that I did not see any iconography or any attributes that could relate to, in my mind, to St. John the Baptist. And we call him St. John the Baptist. He has made other similar paintings, other young men like that. To me, he was just a young man. He did not have a staff or anything like that. Did you find out anything why we call?
Well, the Louvre categorizes it that way, a very androgynous St. John, as you know from seeing it in the Louvre. And Leonardo, it's confusing because he actually does it twice. And there's one of them that because John the Baptist is very androgynous, very sexual looking, and has a come hither look that's almost frightening, it is a century later, when people were more prudish, is changed to a Bacchus. And the cross is made into a staff with grapevines, and they put a loincloth, because he was nude in the original Leonardo. So there are times when people are uncomfortable with the sensuality of Leonardo.
I have a funny story about that painting that just sold. I saw it in London. I saw it with a friend who's an art historian from Italy. He's an art historian of the Renaissance, and his conclusion is that it wasn't done entirely by Leonardo. He said, Karen, if I discover a painting by Leonardo, everybody make money.
Yeah.
Discover a painting not by Leonardo, nobody make money.
Well, there's also another issue there that's a deep issue, which is back then art was not a solo endeavor. It wasn't like you were a great artist and you signed your paintings. You worked in a workshop. And we even have contemporaries who go visit Leonardo's workshop, and he says he's got 12 apprentices and assistants and colleagues, and he goes around, he does the underdrawings. When people make a bit of mistake, he'll correct it and draw brushstrokes on it. There's Salvador Mundi there. And so some of those paintings, Virgin of the Rocks specifically, because there's a lawsuit at the time about how much of it is really, they thought it wasn't enough by Leonardo. They thought he had delegated too much. But what we call, a sloughing off work, they called collaboration because they weren't solo artists back then.
Ma'am?
I had read that the Mona Lisa was one of the maybe the only paintings that he was commissioned to do that he had pretty much absconded with to Paris. And is that because it was his personal favorite? I think he left it to his last lover. Is that how it wound up in the Louvre? That's my question.
Well,
What's your favorite?
they're both the Mona Lisa questions, because the Mona Lisa is clearly, in my mind, the most amazing painting ever done. Yes, he's commissioned by Lisa de Gioconda's husband to do, his wife Lisa in 1503. In 1519, he's carried it with him from Florence to Milan to Rome to Bologna, and then across the Alps to France. He's not letting it go. He never delivers it. He's always perfecting it. He actually has 3 other paintings with him, including St. John, that he just keeps with him. However, this is not that unusual. Leonardo da Vinci, the very first portrait he does, the one that keeps flickering up there, that's also a cloth merchant's work, he doesn't deliver that either because he keeps it so much. So there is something about Leonardo that once he gets something really, really good, he wants to keep perfecting it year after year and doesn't deliver it. By the way, Steve Jobs holds up shipping the original Macintosh because the circuit board inside isn't beautiful enough. And they say, well, that's ridiculous. Nobody's going to see it. Nobody will ever know. And Steve says, yes, you will know. And Steve holds on to it, which is, by the way, one reason he gets fired at Apple eventually in the early days is because he was such a perfectionist.
Sir?
I was in Paris this summer, and this fall in October. I went to see the Mona Lisa. I visited it several times. It's now really impossible to see the Mona Lisa. There's a bullpen that keeps you about 20, 30 feet away.
And remember, somebody shot it when they didn't have a bullpen, so you can't blame the Louvre.
Right.
Yeah.
And hundreds of people are taking selfies with the Mona Lisa, which
That's
is
the thing
also...
that drives you nuts, which is there are all these people there that come from all over the world, and none of them are looking at the painting. They're all going like this, which to prove that they were at the painting. It's insane, and it destroys our ability to see things. But by the way, you go to a concert. You can go to Jazz Fest, and half the people are there watching the concert as their video. I don't know what they're doing with that videotape, but so it is a problem of this day and generation. If I'll do a plug for Friends of the Louvre. If you go to their website and you become a donor, these are the things one does. You can go see it after hours or on Tuesday when it's closed, which is what I did. They also have one day a year, which is really hard to do, when they take it out of the frame and to look at. But here's a final thing I'll say about it. They've cleaned Saint and Madonna and Child. It's beautiful. The sky's blue, everything else. The Mona Lisa, that's not the way he painted it. That's got varnish on it that he never put there, that is yellowed over the centuries, and even over the past 5 or 6 decades, according to Pierre de Louvain, the curator of it, that's just made it harder to see. It should be cleaned. The varnish can be removed without touching the paint. But French governments have fallen for less than deciding they're going to allow poor Pierre de Louvain to restore and clean the Mona Lisa. Someday, there will be a French leader like de Gaulle who just says, l'état c'est moi, and will say, we can take it out of commission for a full year, take the varnish off and clean it, and it'll be wonderful.
What is your assessment of the television series that they made on Einstein?
I liked that one. I liked it better than the movie. What?
I thought it was wonderful.
Oh, you did. It was called Genius. It was done by Ron Howard, the director and writer. And it was very faithful to the science, which is all. Now, obviously, we got to the point we were talking about earlier of are you adding a few things. It did perhaps over-dramatize, this kindly, curly-haired old professor's sexual love life and his, mistress and his, secretary. That gets a bit over-dramatized. But what's really cool is the science is good. And as the young Einstein, a guy named Johnny Flynn, who I met, never had heard of, He's actually a musician. I think he's going to play in New Orleans at some point. But he plays the young Einstein, and he does a wonderful scene where he's riding on the bicycle with Einstein's first girlfriend, and they're going really fast, and he says, "Come with me. Imagine we're chasing this light beam. This light beam is coming from the sun. Let's imagine what happens when we catch up with the light beam. Or is the wave stationary?" And she said, "Well, yeah, of course it would be." He said, and he's going, "Well, Maxwell's equations don't allow for that." And you think, this is very sophisticated for, you know, a TV movie, but it's gorgeous.
I've been in those Hollywood story meetings, and I can tell you how it happens. Some executive says, "All right, we get all this science business, but could Einstein be like a really great lover?"
Yeah.
Do you, when you're doing an autobiography, a biography of a living individual, do you require that they take your version of it? I think you commented in Steve Jobs' book that he agreed to take what you wrote.
Yeah, he agreed to have no control, which is the one thing I still don't understand about Steve Jobs, because he was such a control freak. I couldn't figure out, why is he letting me do this, telling me everything, spending day after day with me, but asking for no control over the book. I asked him at one point, and he said, because if it's an authorized biography and I have control over it, nobody will believe it, it'll, you know, be forgotten. But if you do a warts and all portrayal, and it's not an authorized, meaning he gets to approve every sentence, then it'll be a book for the ages, and even if I won't like parts of it, it'll be better than these books turned out about corporate leaders in which they get to pick the writer and choose. One thing about you said about the book and seeing the pictures, Rosemary and I were talking about, I want to give a shout out to Simon & Schuster, the publisher. Because when you pick up the book, you say, wow, that's a bit heavy. Because every page in that book is art paper, meaning it's 80-pound stock, coated pure white with 4-color, super sharp resolution of the images. Usually people stick 12 pages or so of that in the middle of a book, and you have to flip to go see it. But and they did it by and kept it down at the price of regular biographies. In fact, it's lower than most biographies like Chernow or Doris Kearns Goodwin are now $40. I said, we're going to keep, please, the price down to, you know, in the 30s, and every page has got to be high-quality art paper with reproductions that we get to see, so that if you're being asked about why did he do the Milan Cathedral and that way, or the painting that Bramante does of him and Leonardo, and it says there's Leonardo with the, you know, his well-proportioned body and curly hair, you just look right there. You don't have to go finding it. It's on, and so we work to make sure they're on the facing page. This is not only a shout out to Simon & Schuster, but it's my denigration of the audio book, which I know is good, but you should at least get the pictures if you get the audio book, so you can look at the pictures while you're listening.
I have to say, the book is one of the most beautifully produced biography I've ever
And
seen.
it does, I mean, it's done well enough, I mean, very well, which I don't think is just, you know, me or Leonardo. It was a question Simon & Schuster had, which is, if you actually don't put something on junky paper and you put it high quality and you decide to make something that feels different, it's either going to flop or people are going to prefer it. And it was kind of encouraging that, you know, having high quality paper seems, I think, to have been something that people decided they wanted.
It's like, it's almost an homage to Leonardo himself.
Right, Leonardo would not have liked
He
me to
would-
put the reproductions
No.
on the junky paper they
Not
sometimes
at
use.
all. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Rosemary asked that we end at about this hour so that you could enjoy refreshments, get your book signed, and get to the Saints game on time.
And get your book signed.
Get
We'll
my
all
book
sign
signed.
books.
But thank you very much.
And the Saints will win.